Oh. All right. Let's see if it's working now. All right. Now, see, this is why I don't tell anybody on the YouTube channel about my Twitch streams. This is why I've never told them that this happens, because then I'd have potentially dozens of people seeing it and not just 3, however many people are here right now. Welcome back. Okay, so I think OBS is working now. I assume you guys got the correct notification this time. I know I can change it in, like, I can change all the stream stuff. I can change the title and stuff while the stream's going. I just couldn't do it from OBS, and I wasn't logged in anyway. All right, so now. Okay, yeah, so we're talking about Federalist number 10, and we're going to do Federalist number 10 and Federalist number 11. Yeah, the OBS chat's working now. But, noticing the overlay is not working. Let me take a look at that. Yeah, the overlay is being weird. All right, well, we'll just look, I guess. As it scrolls up, it won't matter. All right. See, this is the riveting content you guys tune in early for. You can see an old man struggle with technology. All right. Okay, yeah, so these are not my notes. This book is from, hey, Reindeer. Yes, no, Federalist 10 is very important. I mean, it became important later. It wasn't important at the beginning. So I'm using archive.org. I found one of the copies of the Federalist Papers on there. So that's what I'm using. This is a copy that was scanned and posted on archive.org. And yeah, it's an edition from around the turn of the century. Now, with regard to Federalist 10, it was kind of, it wasn't really a big deal for a really long time. And then in the early 20th century, in 1913, there was a famous, actually, let me bring this up. So there was a historian named Charles A. Beard. Whoops. Charles A. Beard. This guy. He published a book in, yeah, you know, yeah, okay, yeah, flipping back and forth. TYZJ, yeah, the margin notes are always more interesting if the book is older. Yeah. He published a history in 1913 called An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution of the United States. And he was a progressive. This was back during the progressive era. And he was really into, like, I don't know, economic stuff and class issues and, you know, wealthy and poor. And he interpreted the Constitution. He had a particular way of interpreting the Constitution. So back in the 19th century, this is my understanding. I'm not an Americanist, so this is going to be a very simplistic version of it, of the historiography. But as I understand it, back in the 19th century, historians tended to interpret the creation of the Constitution as something that was done by intellectuals who were thinking very deeply about political philosophy and trying to construct a very, you know, a good government from a philosophical standpoint. And then Charles Beard in 1913 published this book in which he said that the Constitution was about class issues, and it was about the wealthy in the new country constructing a government that would serve their interests. And so he had a very class-minded interpretation of, like, how the Constitution was constructed. Let me see what's going on in the chat. Oh, yeah, you know, I didn't even notice that. He does not have a beard. You're right, Eric. He must have had a beard at some point. Are there any other pictures of him? Oh, he doesn't have a beard there either. Gosh darn it, what was he thinking? Of course, beards were out of fashion at that time, but that's no excuse. Okay, so anyway, he's the one who made a big deal about Federalist Number 10. And he said the Federalist Number 10 supported his interpretation. And then his way of approaching interpretation of that era was very influential in 20th century historiography. Historians in the 20th century interpreting the founding of the country. It's not in favor anymore, as I understand it. It's pretty outmoded now, but it was influential at the time. So, but ever since then, ever since 1913, Federalist 10 has been like examined very closely. There's a ton of work, tons of articles and books have been written just on Federalist 10 and interpreting it in different ways. All right. So, let's get into it. Number 10. Oh, and this is Madison, by the way. James Madison. This is Madison's first essay for the Federalist Papers. Among the numerous advantages promised by a well-constructed union, none deserves to be more accurately developed than its tendency to break and control the violence of faction. Now, faction, that's the key theme of this entire essay, is the idea of faction. In other words, well, he defines it, actually, in the course of this. The friend of popular governments never finds himself so much alarmed for their character and fate as when he contemplates their propensity to this dangerous vice. And I guess I'll kind of preface this essay by saying he's touching on one of the core difficulties of constructing a democratic government, which is that, like, how do you prevent, like, the idea, in theory, the idea of a democracy is that it's better than a monarchy or an autocracy, because in an autocratic government, you have just one person, and he makes all the decisions, and he forces his will on everybody else, and it can turn into a despotism. And so you'd think, oh, well, the solution is, have people vote for their leader and have people vote, to decide what the laws are going to be. But then the obvious problem with that is, well, what's to stop them from also being autocratic or also being despotic, not autocratic, but also being despotic? And so he's addressing that here. It was kind of the conventional wisdom at the time in the 18th century that the only way you could have a democratic government was if the government was very small. And so he's going to address that point also in the course of this essay. I guess just as an aside, in one of my videos where I talked about traveling through time to the Middle Ages, I think the second one, I answered a question where people were like, what if I try to talk about democracy to the people of the Middle Ages? And I was like, well, don't bother. It's not going to do anything. And I think people misinterpreted me to say that people in the Middle Ages wouldn't understand democracy. That's not it. People in the Middle Ages knew what democracy was. Their democracies existed in the Middle Ages in Europe. It's just that I was in answering the idea of, oh, what if I go back and like do all these political reforms and turn those countries democratic? I don't think that's realistic. People in the Middle Ages had democracies, but they were always really small. They'd be like little city-states or little villages or mountain valleys or whatever, like little tiny things where people knew each other. And the conventional wisdom in the 18th century was that you can have a democracy when it's a very small government, but as you get into larger and larger governments, you need one person in charge controlling everything. Like if you have a somewhat larger country, like say Venice, then you can't have a democracy anymore, then you can have an oligarchy. Then you have a really big country like France or Austria or something like that, then you can't even have an oligarchy anymore. At that point, you have to have a monarch. I almost said monocrat, which was Jefferson's term, a monarch. Reindeer, if I remember correctly, the fact that democracy was the thing for tiny places was popular throughout history, some sort of Athens heritage. Yes. Yeah, so Athens was a democracy of a sort. I mean, yeah, by its terms it was. And that was always remembered as having been a democracy. Yeah. Yes, and that's the thing about, so TYZJ says he thought the best system was a mix of democracy, monarchy, and aristocracy. Yeah, so some of the founding fathers would talk about that as the strength of the Constitution as it was drafted in Philadelphia in 1787, is that it combined all three of those things. Okay, yeah, so I haven't read Polybius, but it makes sense that they would say that. Or he would say that people at the time would think that. Oh, Thomas Aquinas said the best system is a mix. I didn't realize that. Oh yeah, okay. I missed your previous point about Thomas Aquinas. I haven't read Thomas Aquinas's political writings. I've been wanting to read Dante's political writings, actually. Dante had some political ideas. Anyway. All right, yeah, so let me get back into the essay. The friend of popular governments. Oh, yeah, and let me just point out the term popular governments, it's worth noting here. In the course, I can't remember if it's in this essay, but in the course of the Federalist Papers, Publius distinguishes between the terms democracy and republic. He makes a nuanced kind of differentiation between those two terms. And so, as a way of talking about kind of the more general concept of government run by the people, he will use the term popular government. So popular government includes both a democratic system and a republic. The friend of popular governments never finds himself so much alarmed for their character and fate as when he contemplates their propensity to this dangerous vice, the vice of breaking up into factions. He will not fail, therefore, to set a due value on any plan which, without violating the principles to which he is attached, provides a proper cure for it. The instability, injustice, and confusion introduced into the public councils have in truth been the mortal diseases under which popular governments have everywhere perished. As they continue to be the favorite and fruitful topics from which the adversaries to liberty derive their most specious declamations. In other words, the people who are opposed to democracy say that democracy just inevitably leads to bad things. The valuable improvements made, and by the way, if I could just have a little bit of a side rant here, like I kind of laughed at Jefferson in one of my videos, and some people were really offended by that. And because I laughed at Jefferson because Jefferson thought that Adams and Hamilton wanted to roll back the revolution, and they were anti-democratic and wanted to create a monarchy, and that's so absurd. That is so incredibly absurd. And then there were people going into the comments who were Jefferson stans defending his honor and saying, "Oh, he was right, though." No, he wasn't right. He was bonkers. Adams and Hamilton were not anti-democratic. And this is Madison writing this, but in other essays, Hamilton says, no, actually, we're trying to establish democracy here. Anyway, sorry about that. It's just so ridiculous. TYZJ says Henry used a simple democracy and pure republic is the same thing, and Gary used too Republican, say too Democratic. Yeah. Okay, where was I before I just went off on Jefferson? The instability, injustice, and confusion introduced into the public councils have, in truth, been the mortal diseases under which popular governments have everywhere perished. As they continue to be the favored and fruitful topics from which the adversaries to liberty derive their most specious declamations. The valuable improvements made by the American constitutions on the popular models, both ancient and modern, cannot certainly be too much admired. He's referring to, when he says American constitutions, he's referring to the constitutions of the states. So when the War of Independence started, all the colonies that were now becoming independent all created new constitutions right around 1776, 1777. And they all had various degrees of democraticness. Some of them were extremely democratic, and some of them, they just had like a single branch of government. They just had a legislature. It was elected by popular, suffrage, and it made all the laws. Other ones had more, checks and balances. Anyway, he's saying here the American constitutions, the state constitutions that were passed in the 1770s, were building on and improving upon the models of previous democracies that existed going back to ancient Greece. But it would be an unwarrantable partiality to contend that they have as effectually obviated the danger on this side as was wished and expected. Complaints are everywhere heard from our most considerate and virtuous citizens, equally the friends of public and private faith and of public and personal liberty, that our governments are too unstable, that the public good is disregarded in the conflicts of rival parties, and that measures are too often decided, not according to the rules of justice and the rights of the minor party, but by the superior force of an interested and overbearing majority. However anxiously we may wish that these complaints had no foundation, the evidence of known facts will not permit us to deny that they are in some degree true. In other words, that some of the state constitutions were a little bit too democratic and allowed for the majority to basically, take away the take away the rights of the minority, of the political minority, or kind of lord it over them, take advantage of their majority position. It will be found, indeed, on a candid review of our situation, that some of the distresses under which we labor have been erroneously charged on the operation of our governments. But it will be found, at the same time, that other causes will not alone account for many of our heaviest misfortunes, and particularly for that prevailing and increasing distrust of public engagements and alarm for private rights, which are echoed from one end of the continent to the other. These must be chiefly, if not wholly, effects of the unsteadiness and injustice with which a factious spirit has tainted our public administrations. And here he defines faction. Hey, Elixir, thank you for joining us. Why was it written down on paper and not other material? The Constitution? I don't know. That's the material they had. You mean like why didn't they like carve it into Mount Rushmore? I don't know what you're asking. Just based on, I don't know. Why not stone tablets? Yeah. Okay. So if anyone's watching and doesn't know, Elixir's on Discord, and I'm already familiar with him, with his personality. Okay. Where was I? Okay, he's going to define faction here. By a faction, I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. All right, so this is important. He's defining faction here. And what he's saying that a faction is that faction is a group of citizens, and they can be either a minority of the population or they can be in the majority. They could be over 50% of the population. Even if you have a majority of the community, they could still potentially be a faction if they are united around some common impulse of passion, which I would interpret that to mean some ideology. We would put it in modern language. They're united around some ideology or around some economic interest. And this last part is also important, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent interests of the community. So they're focused on the well-being of their group and not on the well-being of the community as a whole. So that's what a faction is. Now, a faction can be the majority of the population, and here's where a democracy can fail, is where you have a majority of the population that acts in a way, manipulates the government to serve their own interests without regard to the rest of the population, without regard to the community as a whole. There are two methods So faction, from his point of view, faction is always bad. Faction's always a cancer on the body politic. Like a literal, not a literal cancer, but not cancer in the 4chan sense, but cancer in the real sense of like body politic being affected by this thing within it that's going to destroy it from within. And so it needs a cure. It's a problem. It can harm the body politic, so it needs a cure. And Madison says there are two methods of curing the mischiefs of faction. The one by removing its causes, and the other by controlling its effects. You can either deal with the cause or you can deal with the effect. Well, okay, so Eric said, again, he's pointing at the states, but he's saying it won't happen to the federal government. Okay, he kind of addresses that here. I mean, you might not necessarily agree with how he does address that point, though, in the course of this. We'll see. Sort of. So Elixir asks if there's an argument against direct democracy in favor of representative democracy. That is part of it. That is part of what he's going to get at. That direct democracy is bad. Representative democracy is good. But there's more to it than that. All right. So he says you can deal with faction either by addressing the causes of the faction of faction arising or dealing with the effects of faction arising. There are, again, so he addresses the causes now. There are two methods of removing the causes of faction. You can either destroy the liberty, I'll read his words. The one by destroying the liberty, which is essential to its existence. The other by giving to every citizen the same opinions, the same passions, and the same interests. Reindeer, I'm not sure about the definition of faction, just a majority with interests that are different from the states. Well, it can be a majority or a minority. I point out majority. I mean, he's going to get to this a little bit later. A minority faction is easy enough to deal with, and he'll talk about this. The majority just, like, they're a minority, they can't win an election by themselves. So that takes care of that. Majority is a little bit tougher, because if you have a democracy and a majority decides to do something bad with their political power, that could cause problems. So that's why I was highlighting the idea of majority being an important concept here. But the idea is, you have the community, and the community has, like, you'll have collective well-being for the community. But if you have some portion of the population that tries to use the government to serve their own interests and not the well-being of the community as a whole, that's faction. That's what he's saying. He's kind of against parties. Yes, Reindeer. Now, parties in the modern sense didn't exist at the time. So no one at the time was thinking exactly in the terms of what we now know as parties. Although, in retrospect, well, I mean, we'll probably get to this later on in the essay. He would probably feel more comfortable with the party system as it exists in the U.S. than the party system that exists in some other countries. But yeah, in general, nobody liked the idea of party in the 1780s in the U.S. or anywhere else, really. Okay, so let me continue. So there are two ways of, he says, there are two ways of removing the causes of faction. You can either take away people's liberty. So if people don't have liberty, then they can't have faction. Or you can get everybody to have the same opinions, same passions, the same interests. It could, and he doesn't think that's good, but he's going to explain here why he doesn't think that that's the way to go. It could never be more truly said than of the first remedy, taking away people's liberty, that it was worse than the disease. Liberty is to faction what air is to fire, an ailment without which it instantly expires. But it could not be less folly to abolish liberty, which is essential to political life, because it nourishes faction, than it would be to wish the annihilation of air, which is essential to animal life, because it imparts to fire its destructive agency. The second expedient is as impracticable as the first would be unwise. As long as the reason of man continues fallible, and he is at liberty to exercise it, different opinions will be formed. As long as the connection subsists between his reason and his self-love, his opinions and his passions will have a reciprocal influence on each other, and the former will be objects to which the latter will attach themselves. The diversity in the faculties of men, from which the rights of property originate, is not less an insuperable obstacle to a uniformity of interests. The protection of these faculties is the first object of government. From the protection of different and unequal faculties of acquiring property, the possession of different degrees and kinds of property immediately results, and from the influence of these on the sentiments and views of the respective proprietors ensues a division of the society into different interests and parties. Eric's on board. He totally agrees with Madison here. Consolidation of factions to make parties. Yep. Well, maybe Elixir. Maybe. I guess it depends on what the goals are of the people making up a political party. Fish, could the portion of giving everyone the same opinions and passions be in reference to the creation of one homogeneous culture? Sort of. So what he's referring to here, I believe, my understanding. So let me just recap really quick. So he said there were two ways of preventing the causes of factions, preventing factions from forming to begin with. One is to take away people's liberty, and he said that's a non-starter. Take away people's liberty, then what's the point of any of it? Like, it's just like, as he says, it's the cure is worse than the disease in that point. Then he goes to the second way of preventing faction from forming, which is to get everybody to think the same. What was his opinion? I want to stay close to his language here. Same opinions, same passions, and same interests. So what he's this represents a departure from the way people dealt with this problem before. Like, if you go back to ancient Greece, they had these little democratic systems. Obviously, they also had to worry about faction and about demagoguery and things like that. How do you deal with it? Their solution was to do this, to get everybody to think the same, not think the same in the sense of like they all like were robots and thought exactly the same thing, but have same opinions, same passions, same interests. Whoops. That's also the point of view in the Middle Ages. That was the point of view. In order for a society to function, everybody has to, the idea is everybody has to be on the same page on certain fundamental principles. So you want everybody, for example, you want everybody worshiping the same gods in ancient Greece, for example. Like when, in Rome, Christianity and the Jews and the Christians weren't worshiping the gods that everyone else was worshiping, and that was seen as an existential threat to Rome. That's why they were persecuted. It's because you want everybody being on the same page. You want everybody participating in the same way. Because if you don't have everybody agreeing on certain basic principles, then the political body will fall apart. You can think of it like in modern terms too. I don't know if these analogies would make sense, but like I don't remember, but I know that in the 1960s, there were war protesters protesting the Vietnam War. And a lot of Americans were really offended by that because their point of view was, this is something that we as a republic have embarked upon, the war in Vietnam. If you're not, and they didn't necessarily use this language, but I think this is where they were coming from. If you're not supporting the war effort, if you're trying to undermine the war effort, then you're undermining the republic. So that becomes an existential threat to the republic because you have a faction which is diametrically opposed to what the republic is doing. Instead of everybody being on the same page and supporting it. I don't know if that's a good analogy because that's a particular policy that the republic was following. Maybe a better analogy would be like flag burning. Some Americans think you should be able to burn the flag. That's just a matter of free speech. Other Americans say if you're burning the flag, that's an existential threat to the republic. Not that an individual flag burner is necessarily going to bring down the country, but that if that little, you have that little group of people, that small cell of people that's flag burning, which essentially means they're not buying into what the republic stands for. They're not buying into the body politic. If that were to grow and get to a critical mass, you could have enough people living here who aren't participating, who aren't buying into the political system, who aren't, taking ownership of the republic, that the republic will no longer be able to function. And so, in other words, they'll form a faction that is opposed to what the broad community needs to do. So there are always like fundamental ideas that everyone, this is the idea, this is the thinking. There are fundamental concepts, fundamental principles that everyone in a republic needs to agree upon in order for the republic to be able to succeed. If you just take a republic and you just take randomly different populations of people with different cultures and different philosophies, different political ideas, and you just mash them together and say, okay, guys, you're now going to form a republic. The idea here, the thinking here is there's no cohesion. So they're not going to be able to function together as a single political entity, as political society. And so therefore the solution is what the ancient Greeks called pedia, a kind of like education or training. You train everybody to think in certain like ways. You train them, for example, like in the US, you do the Pledge of Allegiance, you teach them about the Constitution and about the Founding Fathers. You instill in them an identification with the Republic that they will buy into it. You instill in them a sense of duty. Like it is your duty to, serve the Republic. Or in the case of ancient Greece, it is your duty to go out and fight for your city, to protect your city from invasion or whatever. So this idea of same opinions, same passions, same interests, partly is touching on this. It's an ideological thing. Everyone needs to be ideologically on board together. And so in order to prevent faction, you train everybody to think the same way with regard to the political system, with regard to the Republic. And then also same interests. It could also be seen as particularly dangerous if there was like some citizens had much more than other citizens, and so there might also be a motivation to keep everybody level that way. Pack of monkeys? What is it? I'm tempted to look it up, but I don't want to go off on a tangent. I'm kind of curious about that. If you guys figure it out, let me know, because now I'm curious. What is the correct collective for monkeys? Okay. All right, so continuing on with Madison's argument here. So Madison is departing from the traditional view. He's saying it's not about training the people of the Republic to share common values and share common interests. It's something else instead. And he'll kind of elaborate on that and explain why he thinks that. All right, so the latent causes of faction are thus sown in the nature of man, and we see them everywhere brought into different degrees of activity according to the different circumstances of civil society. A zeal for different opinions concerning religion. So in other words, he's saying, the broad idea is it's unrealistic to think that you can get everyone in society to share common political values or to be on the same page in that regard. That's not realistic from the standpoint of human nature. That's Madison's argument here. A zeal for different opinions concerning religion, concerning government, and many other points, as well as of speculation as of practice, an attachment to different leaders ambitiously contending for preeminence and power, or to persons of other descriptions whose fortunes have been interesting to the human passions, have in turn divided mankind into parties, inflamed them with mutual animosity, and rendered them much more disposed to vex and oppress each other than to cooperate for their common good. So strong is this propensity of mankind to fall into mutual animosities, that where no substantial occasion presents itself, The most frivolous and fanciful distinctions have been sufficient to kindle their unfriendly passions and excite their most violent conflicts. But the most common and durable source of factions has been the various and unequal distribution of property. Those who hold and those who are without property have ever formed distinct interests in society. Those who are creditors and those who are debtors fall under a like discrimination. A landed interest, a manufacturing interest, a mercantile interest, a moneyed interest, and many lesser interests grow up of necessity in civilized nations, and divide them into different classes actuated by different sentiments and views. The regulation of these various and interfering interests forms the principal task of modern legislation, and involves the spirit of party and faction in the necessary and ordinary operations of the government. So he says there are a number of ways in which people are going to divide themselves up into groups or into parties, into factions. And he says there, it might be religion, it might be government ideology, might be loyalty to a certain person, a demagogue perhaps. And most importantly, he says it's about class. Class distinctions, economic distinctions are the most potent ways in which people are divided up into different factions. And when he says interest, so before, when he defined faction as a group of people who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, when he says interest, he's referring to economic interest. People who share a common economic interest. Like, for example, in the 19th century, there was an ongoing, very heated debate over whether tariffs should be high or low. And that really boiled down to economic interest. Some people had an economic interest in the tariffs being high. Some people had an economic interest in the tariffs being low. So that would be an example of what he's talking about. Chinese language class, teacher reading the text to students. I think I said this before. I don't remember where I said this. I said this somewhere to somebody, but this is how they used to do it in the West too. The teacher would read the text to the students. Thank you, Eric. I assume you're talking about me. So, the class, and when he talks about these class distinctions, he's talking about these different distinctions, but they're not all the same. I guess it's worth pointing out. I don't know if it's worth pointing out or if this is obvious, but he says people who, let me you to his language. Those who hold and those who are without property have ever formed distinct interests in society. So you have people who have property, you have people who don't have property. And then there's creditors and debtors. That's not necessarily the same thing. You can have really very rich people who have a lot of debt. You can have poor or middling class people who don't have much debt, or could even be creditors. And then he says landed interest, manufacturing interest, mercantile interest. That could be rich or poor. It's just that they have they occupy different sectors of the economy. They're involved in different, their well-being. A policy that favors manufacturing will favor everybody who's working in that manufacturing sector, regardless of the rich and poor. So he's not saying there's only just two types of people. He's not saying there's a simple, linear gradient in society. There are lots of different economic interests, different peoples, different people groups within the society that have different various economic interests coming from different angles, depending on what sector of the economy they're from or how much wealth they have and so on. Let me make sure I got up to here regularly. Okay, so no man is allowed to be a judge in his own cause. Now, this is an important point he's going to get into here about the nature of democratic government and how it, how problematic it can be. No man is allowed to be a judge in his own cause, because his interest would certainly bias his judgment, and not improbably corrupt his integrity. With equal, nay, with greater reason, a body of men are unfit to be both judges and parties at the same time. Yet what are many of the most important acts of legislation but so many judicial determinations? Not indeed concerning the rights of single persons, but concerning the rights of large bodies of citizens. And what are the different classes of legislators but advocates and parties to the causes which they determine? Is a law proposed concerning private debts, It is a question to which the creditors are parties on one side and the debtors on the other. Justice ought to hold the balance between them, yet the parties are and must be themselves the judges, and the most numerous party, or in other words, the most powerful faction, must be expected to prevail. Shall domestic manufactures be encouraged, and in what degree, by restrictions on foreign manufactures, are questions which would be differently decided by the landed and the manufacturing classes, and probably by neither with a sole regard to justice and the public good. The apportionment of taxes on the various descriptions of property is an act which seems to require the most exact impartiality, yet there is perhaps no legislative act in which greater opportunity and temptation are given to a predominant party to trample on the rules of justice. Every shilling with which they overburden the inferior number is a shilling saved to their own pockets. To kind of summarize what he said there, if you have a dispute of interest between two parties in a court case, you have an impartial judge who will decide between those two parties. But in the case of lawmaking in a democratic society where you have a legislature that's making a law, and the laws essentially act like judicial decisions because they're deciding between two different options, one of which will benefit some people financially and hurt others financially, and vice versa. But you don't have an impartial judge sitting above the legislature that decides between those two factions. Instead, it's the factions themselves. It's as if you had a court case where the two parties, the plaintiff and the defendant, are the ones who are going to decide the case themselves. And so what inevitably would happen is, in a democratic system, whoever has the majority in the legislature will just decide in their own interest. And then going on to the next paragraph. It is in vain to say that enlightened statesmen will be able to adjust these clashing interests and render them all subservient to the public good. Enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm, nor in many cases can such an adjustment be made at all without taking into view indirect and remote considerations which will rarely prevail over the immediate interest which one party may find in disregarding the rights of another or the good of the whole. The inference to which we are brought is that the causes of faction cannot be removed, and that relief is only to be sought in the means of controlling its effects. So he's gone through, the two options for controlling faction, for dealing with the case of faction in a democracy. One is to prevent it from happening by addressing the causes. And he's just gone through all of those and said, it's impossible. You can't stop faction from happening. You can't address the causes. You can't approach it from that angle. Now we have to deal with the effects. That's the only way you can deal with it. If a faction consists of less than a majority, relief is supplied by the Republican principle, which enables the majority to defeat its sinister views by regular vote. It may clog the administration, it may convulse the society, but it will be unable to execute and mask its violence under the forms of the Constitution. When a majority is included in a faction, the minority, if the faction is a minority, it's dealt with simply through the fact that majority rules in a democratic society, so it can't use a constitutional means to achieve its ends. But when a majority is included in a faction, the form of popular government, on the other hand, enables it to sacrifice its ruling passion or interest, enables it to sacrifice to its ruling passion or interest both the public good and the rights of other citizens. To secure the public good and private rights against the danger of such a faction, and at the same time to preserve the spirit and the form of popular government, is then the great object to which our inquiries are directed. Let me add that it is the great desideratum, by which alone this form of government can be rescued from the opprobrium under which it has so long labored, and be recommended to the esteem and adoption of mankind. In other words, this is the big objection to democracy. What's the point of setting up a democracy if you're just going to have despotism by the majority? And that's what he's going to address here. By what means is this object attainable? Evidently by one of two only. Either the existence of the same passion or interest in a majority at the same time must be prevented, or the majority, having such coexistent passion or interest, must be rendered by their number and local situation unable to concert and carry into effect schemes of oppression. If the impulse and the opportunity be suffered to coincide, we well know that neither moral nor religious motives can be relied on as an adequate control. They are not found to be such on the injustice and violence of individuals, and lose their efficacy in proportion to the number combined together, that is, in proportion as their efficacy becomes needful. In other words, that old idea that if you just teach the people to be virtuous, that they will naturally just make decisions in democratic government that will serve the well-being of everybody, of the body politic as a whole. Madison argues that's not realistic. That's not how real human beings work. Real human beings are always going to be, selfish and, have poor morals, base motives, no matter what. So what we have to do is figure out how to construct the government in such a way that acknowledges that reality and lets that be, and also achieves the end of having democratic government. From this view of the subject, it may be concluded that a pure democracy, by which I mean a society consisting of a small number of citizens who assemble and administer the government in person, can admit of no cure for the mischiefs of faction. A common passion or interest will, in almost every case, be felt by a majority of the whole. A communication and concert results from the form of government itself, and there is nothing to check the inducements to sacrifice the weaker party or an obnoxious individual. Hence it is that such democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, and have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths. Theoretic politicians, who have patronized this species of government, have erroneously supposed that by reducing mankind to a perfect equality in their political rights, they would at the same time be perfectly equalized and assimilated in their possessions, their opinions, and their passions. Okay. A republic, by which I mean a government in which the scheme of representation takes place, opens a different prospect, and promises the cure for which we are seeking. Let us examine the points in which it varies from pure democracy, and we shall comprehend both the nature of the cure and the efficacy which it must derive from the union. The two great points of difference between a democracy and a republic are, first, the delegation of the government in the latter to a small number of citizens elected by the rest. Secondly, the greater number of citizens and greater sphere of country over which the latter may be extended. So, going back to the earlier question, is this just about representative democracy? That's part of it. That's point number one. And the point number two is having a larger body politic. Extensive over geographical extensiveness and large population. So what he's getting at here is, coming back to the overall point of we need a federal government, we need to approve the Constitution of Philadelphia, instead of leaving the states to themselves. Madison's actually going to make the argument here: the larger the country, the more successful the republic. So it's in our best interest to ratify this Constitution. We'll actually have better political protections. The republic will be more successful and more protected against democratic faction, etc., than it would be if we remained as individual states. The effect of the first difference, the first difference is in a democracy, people represent themselves directly, in a small democratic system like a small town. What are those called? Those small towns in New England that have democratic, what is that called? But anyway, like the difference between that and a republic, you choose your representatives go, and they, select for you, representative democracy. The effect of the first difference is, on the one hand, to refine and enlarge the public views by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens whose wisdom may best discern the true interest of their country, and whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it to temporary or partial considerations. Under such a regulation, it may well happen that the public voice, pronounced by the representatives of the people, will be more consonant to the public good than if pronounced by the people themselves, convened for the purpose. On the other hand, the effect may be inverted. Men of factious tempers, of local prejudices, or of sinister designs may by intrigue, by corruptions, or by other means first obtain the suffrages, and then betray the interests of the people. The question resulting is whether small or extensive republics are most favorable to the election of proper guardians of the public weal, and it is clearly decided in the favor of the latter by two obvious considerations. So he's getting at, like, you're going to have, in a representative democracy, you'll be electing representatives that will be, that could potentially be better positioned to look at the best interests of the public as a whole. Or they could be, or you could have representatives that represent, factions and don't have the well-being of the Commonwealth at heart. And then he says, which one of those is more likely to like, if you're talking about the federal government as a whole versus the state governments individually, in which case are you more likely to have the good outcome in a representative system rather than the bad outcome? Good representatives instead of bad representatives. And he says he's going to argue that it's actually in the larger republic that you'll have more likely to have better representatives that are wiser and have a broader outlook. And he says it's for two reasons. In the first place, it is to be remarked that however small the republic may be, representatives must be raised to a certain number in order to guard against the cabals of a few. And that however large it may be, they must be limited to a certain number in order to guard against the confusion of a multitude. In other words, in order for a republic to work, it can't be too small or too large. Or, I mean, not the republic, sorry, the legislature. In order for a legislature to work, you can't have too few members of the legislature. You can't have too many members of the legislature. You have to have this like moderate size. Hence, the number of representatives in the two cases not being in proportion to that of the constituents, and being proportionally greatest in the small republic, it follows that if the proportion of fit characters be not less in the large than in the small republic, the former will present a greater option, and consequently a greater probability of a fit choice. In the next place, as each representative will be chosen by a greater number of citizens in the large than in the small republic, it will be more difficult for unworthy candidates to practice with success the vicious arts by which elections are too often carried, and the suffrages of the people, being more free, will be more likely to center in men who possess the most attractive merit and the most diffusive and established characters. In other words, if you have a larger group of voters, you're more likely for them to, you're more likely to have a wider, what's that term in baseball? A deeper pen to draw on? I forget what the term is for pitchers in baseball. Your bullpen will be deep. You'll have a greater reserve of talented individuals and wise individuals that the voters can vote for. It's a little bit reminiscent to the argument that was made, I think, in Federalist No, where Hamilton said that in foreign affairs, the federal government will be able to draw on the talents of will be able to elicit the most talented individuals in foreign affairs from all the states, whereas each individual state will be limited to whatever talented individuals they might have in that state. Bench. Yes, thank you. The bench. A deep bench, yes. But bench, that's basketball, right? Is that also baseball? Yeah, that must be baseball. They have a bench in the dugout, so it must be. Anyway. In the next place, as each representative will be chosen by a greater number of citizens. Oh, wait, did I just read that? I feel like I just read that. It must be confessed that in this, as in most other cases, there is a mean on both sides of which inconveniences will be found to lie. By enlarging too much the number of electors, you render the representative too little acquainted with all their local circumstances and lesser interests. As by reducing it too much, you render him unduly attached to these and too little fit to comprehend and pursue great and national objects. The federal constitution forms a happy combination in this respect, the great and aggregate interests being referred to the national, the local, and particular to the state, being referred to the national, the local and particular interests to the state legislatures. CYZJ, thank you. He's talking about the House of Representatives. Yeah, this isn't really germane to the Senate. They will be talking about the House of Representatives and the Senate in detail later on, much later on. We'll be getting to that kind of late summer. We'll be getting to that portion of it, of the Federalist Papers. But in this case, yeah, he's basically talking about the House of Representatives. The other point of difference is the greater number of citizens and extent of territory which may be brought within the compass of Republican than of Democratic government. And it is this circumstance principally which renders factious combinations less to be dreaded in the former than in the latter. The smaller the society, the fewer probably will be the distinct parties and interests composing it. The fewer the distinct parties and interests, the more frequently will a majority be found of the same party. And the smaller the number of individuals composing a majority, and the smaller the compass within which they are placed, the more easily will they concert and execute their plans of oppression. Extend the sphere, and you take in a greater variety of parties and interests. You make it less probable that a majority of the whole will have a common motive to invade the rights of other citizens. Or if such a common motive exists, it will be more difficult for all who feel it to discover their own strength and to act in unison with each other. Besides other impediments, it may be remarked that where there is a consciousness of unjust or dishonorable purposes, communication is always checked by distrust in proportion to the number whose concurrence is necessary. So, this I feel like is the core of his argument about why the federal government would work so much better. It's so big. There will be so many different individual interests, individual groups of people, individual factions, that none of them will be able to form a majority. Even if, he goes on to say in this paragraph, even if you have a bunch of people across the country who feel the same way on a particular issue, it will be harder for them, first of all, to even discover that they form a majority on this issue, because they're all divided up into these different communities, and they're different walks of life and different social circles, and it'll be harder for them to coordinate and become aware of that commonality. And then it'll be harder for them to communicate with each other, and so on. So because of that geographical extension, which some people at the time were arguing was a weakness of the idea of a federal government, that it would be so large it would be unmanageable. He's turning that around and saying, actually, it's a strength. It's going to make the republic stronger. Hence, it clearly appears that the same advantage which a republic has over a democracy in controlling the effects of faction is enjoyed by a large over a small republic, is enjoyed by the Union over the states composing it. Does the advantage consist in this substitution of representatives, whose enlightened views and virtuous sentiments render them superior to local prejudices and to schemes of injustice? It will not be denied that the representation of the Union will be most likely to possess these requisite endowments. Does it consist in the greater security afforded by a greater variety of parties against the event of any one party being able to outnumber and oppress the rest? In an equal degree does the increased variety of parties prized within the Union increase this security. Does it, in fine, consist in the greater obstacles opposed to the concert and accomplishment of the secret wishes of an unjust and interested majority? Here again, the extent of the Union gives it the most palpable advantage. The influence of factious leaders may kindle a flame within their particular states, but will be unable to spread a general conflagration through the other states. A religious sect may degenerate into a political faction in a part of the Confederacy, but the variety of sects dispersed over the entire face of it must secure the national councils against any danger from that source. A rage for paper money, for an abolition of debts, for an equal division of property, or for any other improper or wicked project will be less apt to pervade the whole body of the Union than a particular member of it, in the same proportion as such a malady is more likely to taint a particular county or district than an entire state. In the extent and proper structure of the Union, therefore, we behold a Republican remedy for the diseases most incident to Republican government. And according to the degree of pleasure and pride we feel in being Republicans, ought to be our zeal in cherishing the spirit and supporting the character of Federalists. Publius. One thought I have about this, which is not about this directly, but about how American political culture evolved. There was such, and I think I've mentioned this before, there was such a strong emphasis in American political culture on union, how important the union is. When the southern states started seceding in 1860, 1861, Lincoln talked about the Union. We must preserve the Union. He talked about that in the Gettysburg Address. Part of that was, we've seen before in previous essays of the Federalist Papers, the idea that by having a federal union, the states will be better protected from foreign attack. John Jay talked about that. But also it's this idea that democracy itself will be safer in a union. That's the idea that Madison's talking about here, and this was the position of the pro-Constitution Party, which of course won. There was this idea that democracy itself depends upon the federal government succeeding. If you take away the federal government, you just have the states, you're more likely for those democratic experiments to fail and turn into dictatorships. So this union was seen as an existential threat, not just to the country, not just to the current political system of the federal government, but to democracy itself. Publius Elixir is, he answered your question. Yeah, so there were three authors of these essays. They traded off, they took turns writing different essays. Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, and they all used the same pen name. Yeah, I think that's right. I don't actually know much about Lee, as probably became clear in a conversation on Discord yesterday. I've avoided the Civil War since I was a teenager. When I was a teenager, I was into the Civil War, and then subject I've avoided since then. Yeah. They definitely, Eric, they definitely had this idea that this is an experiment, that they were trying something new and something unprecedented. And they also felt like everything's riding on this. The whole world is depending on us to pull this off. They definitely felt that way. All right, so we're going to move on to number 11 now. Jackson's gift to his grandson. Are you talking about Stonewall Jackson, or are we talking about the Civil War here? I don't know, rather than Andrew Jackson. Wait, Stonewall Jackson didn't have grandchildren, though. You must be referring to Andrew Jackson. Okay. So now we're switching gears now. We're still in the first portion. I guess we can stop at this point, since between 10 and 11 is a little bit of a stopping point. I'm not stopping for the night. I'm going to read number 11, but I can find number 1. I looked at the Wikipedia page for Federalist number 1, and they have the bullet points here. So let's Let's look at these. Oh, that's too close, isn't it? Let's see if that's close enough. Okay. So if you recall from Federalist number 1, Alexander Hamilton wrote that one, and he laid out at the end of that essay his plan for all the Federalist Papers. He said, we're going to cover these 6 points. And we're currently still in point number 1, the utility of the Union to your political prosperity. And in that number, first they addressed utility of Union. In other words, what's the federal government going to do for you? Like, how do you, as a voter or as a citizen of New York, how do you benefit from the Union? You're going to benefit it from protection from foreign invasion, what we talked about in numbers 2 through 5, if I remember correctly, and then protection from interstate war, when they made the argument that that's a real possibility, and then protection from insurrection and faction, which is what we've just been talking about. And then in essays 11, 12, and 13, they address, well, Hamilton specifically addresses certain financial issues that, how the how this proposed federal system will benefit people financially. And so that's what we're getting into with number 11. He's going to talk about the Navy. Commerce and a Navy. Elixir, is there any chance of interstate war returning to the U.S.? Well, that's a question of the future, not of the past. That's out of my wheelhouse. I deal with stuff that's already happened. I have no idea. Your guess is as good as mine about what will happen in the future. All right, so here, this is Alexander Hamilton, and he's going to make the case that commerce would be benefited by by the federal system. The importance of the Union in a commercial light is one of those points about which there is least room to entertain a difference of opinion, and which has in fact commanded the most general assent of men who have any acquaintance with the subject. This applies as well to our intercourse with foreign countries as with each other. There are appearances to authorize a supposition that the adventurous spirit, which distinguishes the commercial character of America, has already excited uneasy sensations in several of the maritime powers of Europe. They seem to be apprehensive of our too great interference in that carrying trade, which is the support of their navigation and the foundation of their naval strength. Those of them who have colonies in America look forward to what this country is capable of becoming with painful solicitude. They foresee the dangers that may threaten their American dominions from the neighborhood of states, which have all the dispositions, and would possess all of the means requisite to the creation of a powerful marine. Impressions of this kind will naturally indicate the policy of fostering divisions among us, and of depriving us as far as possible of an active commerce in our own bottoms. He's referring to ships, by the way. This would answer the threefold purpose of preventing our interference in their navigation, of monopolizing the profits of our trade, and of clipping the wings by which we might soar to a dangerous greatness. Did not prudence forbid the detail, it would not be difficult to trace by facts the workings of this policy to the cabinets of ministers. Oh, hey, Lumen Dex, so welcome. Thanks for joining us. All right, let me get caught up here with the chat. I guess you'll just have to wonder, Elixir. Yeah, I said New York would annex New Jersey. What I said, to answer your question, was that I have no idea. That was my answer. As a historian, I have no idea because I only know about the past. Oh yeah, okay. Eric, wisdom for the future. Okay. All right, so I'll continue on with Hamilton's argument here. If we continue united, we may counteract a policy so unfriendly to our prosperity in a variety of ways. By prohibitory regulations extending at the same time throughout the states, we may oblige foreign countries to bid against each other for the privilege of our markets. This assertion will not appear chimerical to to those who are able to appreciate the importance of the markets of 3 million of people, increasing in rapid progression, for the most part exclusively addicted to agriculture and likely from local circumstances to remain so, to any manufacturing nation. And the immense difference there would be to the trade and navigation of such a nation between a direct communication in its own ships and an indirect conveyance of its products and returns to and from America in the ships of another country. Suppose, for instance, we had a government in America capable of excluding Great Britain, with whom we have at present no treaty of commerce, from all our ports. What would be the probable operation of this step upon her politics? Would it not enable us to negotiate with the fairest prospect of success for commercial privileges of the most valuable and extensive kind in the dominions of that kingdom? When these questions have been asked upon other occasions, they have received a plausible but not a solid or satisfactory answer. It has been said that prohibitions on our part would produce no change in the system of Britain, because she could prosecute her trade with us through the medium of the Dutch, who would be her immediate customers and paymasters for those articles which were wanted for the supply of our markets. But would not her navigation be materially injured by the loss of the important advantage of being her own carrier in that trade? Would not the principal part of its profits be intercepted by the Dutch as a compensation for their agency and risk? Would not the mere circumstance of freight occasion a considerable deduction? Would not so circuitous an intercourse facilitate the competitions of other nations, by enhancing the price of British commodities in our markets and by transferring to other hands the management of this interesting branch of the British commerce? So in other words, basically what he's saying there is, if the states were united in one government, that single government was responsible for negotiating trade agreements with other countries, we as Americans would have a better bargaining position with a country like Great Britain. That's essentially what he said in that paragraph. I'm actually not positive I pronounced that word correctly. Let me just check real quick. Chimerical. Did I say that? Wow, I was lucky. Okay. A mature consideration of the objects suggested by these questions will justify a belief that the real disadvantages to Britain from such a state of things, conspiring with the prepossessions of a great part of the nation in favor of the American trade, and with the importunities of the West India Islands, would produce a relaxation in her present system, and would let us into the enjoyment of privileges in the markets of those islands and elsewhere, from which our trade would derive the most substantial benefits. Such a point gained from the British government, and which could not be expected without an equivalent in exemptions and immunities in our markets, would be likely to have a correspondent effect on the conduct of other nations, who would not be inclined to see themselves altogether supplanted in our trade. A further resource for influencing the conduct of European nations toward us in this respect would arise from the establishment of a federal navy. There can be no doubt that the continuance of the Union under an efficient government would put it in our power, at a period not very distant, to create a navy, which, if it could not vie with those of the great maritime powers, would at least be of respectable weight, if thrown into the scale of either of two contending parties. This would be more peculiarly the case in relation to operations in the West Indies. A few ships of the line, sent opportunely to the reinforcement of either side, would often be sufficient to decide the fate of a campaign, on the event of which interests of the greatest magnitude were suspended. Our position is, in this respect, a very commanding one. And if to this consideration we add that of the usefulness of supplies from this country in the prosecution of military operations in the West Indies, it will readily be perceived that a situation so favorable would enable us to bargain with great advantage for commercial privileges. A price would be set, not only upon our friendship, but upon our neutrality. By a steady adherence to the Union, we may hope ere long to become the arbiter of Europe in America, and to be able to incline the balance of European competitions in this part of the world as our interest may dictate. Yeah, he does love talking war strategy. You know, Hamilton was a strategist. He was Washington's right-hand man during the Revolutionary War, and then later on, he was involved in some war planning, I think in the Washington administration or in the Adams administration. Adams, I think. But yeah, I find this paragraph, just speaking personally, kind of ambitious, kind of optimistic that the U.S. by building a small navy could actually um, be a power broker in the Western Hemisphere. That's anyway. I mean, who knows? It could have. It didn't end up happening that way, but maybe it could have. But in the reverse of this eligible situation, we shall discover that the rival ships of the parts would make them checks upon each other, and would frustrate all the tempting advantages which nature has kindly placed within our reach. In a state so insignificant, our commerce would be a prey to the wanton intermeddlings of all nations at war with each other, who, having nothing to fear from us, would with little scruple or remorse supply their wants by depredations on our property as often as it fell in their way. Rights of neutrality will only be respected when they are defended by an adequate power. A nation despicable by its weakness forfeits even the privilege of being neutral. And this is a point, actually, that would keep coming up over the succeeding decades with the British. Eric. Yeah, perhaps they would not have been as well read if they hadn't had Twitch. Under a vigorous national government, the natural strength and resources of the country directed to a common interest would baffle all the combinations of European jealousy to restrain our growth. This situation would even take away the motive to such combinations by inducing an impracticability of success. An active commerce, an extensive navigation, and a flourishing marine would then be the inevitable offspring of moral and physical necessity. We might defy the little arts of little politicians to control or vary the irresistible and unchangeable course of nature. But, in a state of disunion, these combinations might exist and might operate with success. It would be in the power of the maritime nations, availing themselves of our universal impotence, prescribe the conditions of our political existence. And as they have a common interest in being our carriers, and still more in preventing our becoming theirs, they would in all probability combine to embarrass our navigation in such a manner as would in effect destroy it, and confine us to a passive commerce. We should thus be compelled to content ourselves with the first price of our commodities, and to see the profits of our trade snatched from us to enrich our enemies and prosecutors. That unequaled spirit of enterprise which signalizes the genius of the American merchants and navigators, and which is in itself an inexhaustible mine of national wealth, would be stifled and lost, and poverty and disgrace would overspread a country which with wisdom might make herself the admiration and envy of the world. There are rights of great moment to the trade of America, which are rights of the Union. I allude to the fisheries, to the navigation of the Western Lakes, and to that of the Mississippi. The dissolution of the Confederacy would give room for delicate questions concerning the future existence of these rights, which the interest of more powerful partners would hardly fail to solve to our disadvantage. The disposition of Spain with regard to the Mississippi needs no comment. France and Britain are concerned with us in the fisheries, and view them as of the utmost moment to their navigation. They, of course, would hardly remain long indifferent to that decided mastery, of which experience has shown us to be possessed in this valuable branch of traffic, and by which we are able to undersell those nations in their own markets. What more natural than that? They should be disposed to exclude from the lists such dangerous competitors. Let me just show you what he's talking about here. Got this handy dandy map. So he refers to, let me just recall here, the three particular interests that America has in terms of, commerce are the three he lists here: the fisheries, navigation of the Western Lakes, and the navigation of the Mississippi River. So the fisheries are out in the Atlantic Ocean. The fisheries are to the east of Maine, off the maritime province, Atlantic provinces of Canada, off Newfoundland especially. So as far as I know, those are the main fisheries he's referring to. And then the Western Lakes means the Great Lakes, which is this area here, which of course was in the western part of the country at the time. And the navigation of the Mississippi. The Mississippi at the time formed the western boundary of the United States, on the other side of which was Spanish territory. Louisiana, the Louisiana territory was Spanish in 1787-88 at the time that these were written. And so these, he's referring to, these are the main issues. These are the issues in which the U.S., depends upon, like, the policies of Britain, France, and Spain affect all of these things. And these continued to be major foreign policy issues for the United States during the 19th century. Well, the Mississippi River resolved itself very quickly in 1803. But the Great Lakes and then the fisheries continued to be issues for longer than that. TYZJ, this map actually makes sense about the name of America. 13, the 13 states were the only 13 sovereign states in the Americas during the Confederal period. Yes, I think also, I might be wrong about this, but I would guess it's also the fact that this was the area that was English speaking. And so within the Anglosphere, within the English speaking world, this was the American part of that. So in English, when speaking English, when talking about America, you would naturally be talking about this area because there was so much more connection between these colonies and Britain than between Britain and the rest of the Americas. But yeah, it is true. This was the first part of the Western Hemisphere to become a modern independent country. Obviously, there were parts of the Americas that were still independent in the sense that they had not yet been colonized by European powers or by European derived republics. But yeah, in terms of like a modern country, a westernized country, this was the first one. Eric, how come Spain had two separate colonies instead of one big one? They actually had four at this point. They had been splitting them up. I wonder if I can quickly find a map. I would assume that it was a matter of, does this show? Yeah, this shows the four. I believe that these were split off in the late 1700s, 1770 something, I want to say. But anyway, you're asking why they didn't have just one giant thing. Like all of this is one giant thing. I don't actually know. In terms of like, because they first established the Viceroyalty of New Spain, then they went down and set up the Viceroyalty of Peru. Why wasn't that part of New Spain? Why was that a separate viceroyalty? And it must have something to do with the fact that geographical distance or the fact that they had conquered a separate empire down there. I don't know. I'd have to go back and look at the process, the administrative process of setting up the viceroyalties and what the thinking was there. I mean, certainly it would have been a challenge administratively. So yeah, Elixir says probably governance. I would say that's probably true. It would just be hard to handle it administratively. Now, these were much larger than the British provinces up here on the eastern seaboard of North America. Like New Spain, that was one administration. New Spain was like Mexico, basically. Mexico and surrounding areas, and the Philippines. All that was one colony administered from Mexico City. But yeah, okay. Oh, wait. UYZJ, Vermont maybe is de facto state, but 13 states finally. Oh, is Vermont shown on there? Which one is it? Vermont. Where's Vermont? Oh, did I? Oh, over here. Okay. Oh, yeah. On this map, it's a separate republic. This is from 1789, but it was basically functioning as a separate republic in 1787 also. Oh, I lost my place. Where was I? But in a state of disunion, did I turn the page? Yeah, I'm down here. Yep. Okay. This branch of trade... Oh, which branch is he talking about? He's talking about... Of course, would hardly remain long different to that decided mastery of which experience is shown to be possessed in this variable branch of traffic. The Mississippi, fisheries. Maybe he's talking about all of it collectively. The Mississippi River and the fisheries. This branch of trade ought not to be considered as a partial benefit. All the navigating states may, in different degrees, advantageously participate in it. Oh, yeah, this would be relevant to the Mississippi. This must be what he's talking about. Mississippi is not just a Western issue. Oh, my condolences, Elixir. I'm glad that you came here, that this was your second option. That's good. Maybe this will be more edifying anyway. This branch of trade, what was I talking about? This branch of trade ought not to be considered as a partial benefit. All the navigating states may, in different degrees, advantageously participate in it, and under circumstances of a greater extension of mercantile capital would not be unlikely to do it. As a nursery of seamen it now is, or when time shall have more nearly assimilated the principles of navigation in the several states, will become a universal resource. To the establishment of a navy, oh, that's what he's talking about. Establishment of a navy, it must be indispensable. To this great national object, a navy, union will contribute in various ways. Every institution will grow and flourish in proportion to the quantity and extent of the means concentrated towards its formation and support. A navy of the United States, as it would embrace the resources of all, is an object far less remote than a navy of any single state or partial confederacy, which would only embrace the resources of a part. And this is actually a realistic point, because in the Washington administration, they decided to start building the Navy. They ordered 6 ships, and it took years to even get those 6 ships delivered. I can't even remember. I think maybe a couple of them were canceled. That's for the whole Union. So Hamilton makes a good point that if it's separate states trying to make their own navies, they probably wouldn't have been able to do much. It happens indeed that different portions of Confederated America possess each some peculiar advantage for this essential establishment. The more southern states furnish in greater abundance certain kinds of naval stores, tar, pitch, and turpentine. Their wood, for the construction of ships, is also of a more solid and lasting texture. The difference in the duration of the ships of which the navy might be composed, if chiefly constructed of southern wood, would be of signal importance, either in the view of naval strength or of national economy. Some of the southern and of the middle states yield a greater plenty of iron, and of better quality. Seamen must chiefly be drawn from the northern hive. The necessity of naval protection to external or maritime commerce does not require a particular elucidation, no more than the conduciveness of that species of commerce to the prosperity of a navy. They, by a kind of reaction mutually beneficial, promote each other. An unrestrained intercourse between the states themselves will advance the trade of each, by an interchange of their respective productions, not only for the supply of reciprocal wants at home, but for exportation to foreign markets. The veins of commerce in every part will be replenished, and will acquire additional motion and vigor from a free circulation of the commodities of every part. Commercial enterprise will have much greater scope from the diversity in the productions of different states. When the staple of one fails, from a bad harvest or unproductive crop, it can call to its aid the staple of another. The variety, not less than the value of products for exportation, contributes to the activity of foreign commerce. It can be conducted upon much better terms with a large number of materials of a given value than with a small number of materials of the same value, arising from the competitions of trade and from the fluctuations of markets. Particular articles may be in great demand at certain periods, and unsaleable at others. But if there be a variety of articles, it can scarcely happen that they should all be at one time in the latter predicament, and on this account the operations of the merchant would be less liable to any considerable obstruction or stagnation. The speculative trader will at once perceive the force of these observations, and will acknowledge that the aggregate balance of the commerce of the United States would bid fair to be much more favorable than that of the 13 states without union or with partial union. It may perhaps be replied to this that whether the states are united or disunited, there would still be an intimate intercourse between them, which would answer the same ends. But this intercourse would be fettered, interrupted, and narrowed by a multiplicity of causes, which in the course of these papers have been amply detailed. A unity of commercial as well as political interests can only result from a unity of government. There are other points of view in which this subject might be placed, of a striking and animating kind, but they would lead us too far into the regions of futurity, and would involve topics not proper for a newspaper discussion. I shall briefly observe that our situation invites and our interests prompt us to aim at an ascendant in the system of American affairs. The world may politically as well as geographically be divided into 4 parts, each having a distinct set of interests. Unhappily for the other 3, Europe, by her arms and by her negotiations, by force and by fraud, has in different degrees extended her dominion over them all. Africa, Asia, and America have successively felt her domination. The superiority she has long maintained has tempted her to plume herself as the mistress of the world, and to consider the rest of mankind as created for her benefit. Men, admired as profound philosophers, have in direct terms attributed to her inhabitants a physical superiority, and have gravely asserted that all animals, and with them the human species, degenerate in America. That even dogs cease to bark after having breathed a while in our atmosphere. Facts have too long supported these arrogant pretensions of the European. It belongs to us to vindicate the honor of the human race, and to teach that assuming brother moderation. Union will enable us to do it. Disunion will add another victim to his triumphs. Let Americans disdain to be the instruments of European greatness. Let the 13 states, bound together in a strict and indissoluble union, concur in erecting one great American system, superior to the control of all transatlantic force or influence, and able to dictate the terms of the connection between the old and the new world. Publius. Yeah, stick it to Europe, that's right. That was actually a theory. That was a real theory, I understand it. That there was something different, that animals would actually degenerate when they came over here. Yeah, he really, yep, Hamilton really gets riled up at the end there. All right, so let's see. Hour and 40 minutes. Well, I guess a little less than an hour and 40 minutes, actually. The technical difficulties at the beginning. All right, so class, any questions or comments before we adjourn? Students always thought it was funny I would use the word adjourn. Okay, so we're gonna stop here. I'm going to stream Indiana Jones on Tuesday, and then we might actually make it to Atlantis this Tuesday. We'll see. And then we'll continue with the Federalist Papers next week. And next week we're finishing up this first section. So this first section where he talks about this part here, the utility of the Union to political prosperity, like part 1 of the Federalist Papers. We'll be finishing that up next week with essays 12, 13, and 14. 12 and 13 continue on with economic stuff, and then 14 will be the return of James Madison, and he'll be talking about political stuff. And then after that, we'll be moving on to the problems with the Articles of Confederation, but that'll be the week after that. So that's what we're doing. We're doing 12, 13, and 14 next week. So hope I'll see you then. Thank you for joining me. I'm going to go ahead and quit the stream now, and see you next week.